Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending upon where in the world you are, and welcome to the final panel of ZCon 2. So I'm very pleased to be here today with our illustrious guests. Everybody on this panel has made material contributions to the realm and the domain of internet privacy. And we're going to spend some time today talking about those contributions, and as well as spending some time talking about how we measure progress on that journey. So I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce you to our panelists, and I'm going to go here in reverse alphabetical order. So starting with Teor. Teor is an engineer at the Zcash Foundation. He has worked as a software engineer and researcher on privacy-preserving protocols and large-scale anonymity networks, and also at the Teor project in the University of New South Wales. Previously, they were a data analyst for grants management and fiat currency payment systems. Next up, very pleased to have Nick Sullivan on the panel. Nick is head of research at Cloudflare and also co-chair of the Crypto Forum Research Group. And Cloudflare is one of those companies that I've been paying attention to for a really long time. And they've really become part of the backbone plumbing of the internet. Just about every site that you use is probably fronted by Cloudflare, and yet a lot of people have never heard of the company. But Cloudflare along the way has made some really material contributions to user privacy and internet privacy. And every time I see one of those announcements, I always see Nick's hand in what's going on there. So very, very excited to have Nick on the panel and to talk through some of those key products and features that Cloudflare has brought to us. Next up, Mitchell KT. Mitchell is a privacy researcher specializing in data science and anti-heuristic protocol design in decentralized systems. He's got several projects going in the Zcash ecosystem, including the Network Observatory, analysis of on-chain metadata, and experiments to reduce Zcash block propagation time, as well as hardware acceleration of Halo. Mitchell has also spent time working with the Monero Research Lab. So I'm really pleased to have Mitchell joining us. I think very highly of Monero. I've been using and holding Monero for a long time, and I want to build a culture of cooperation between Zcash and the Monero communities. And then finally, rounding it out, we've got Ashkan Soltani. Ashkan was one of the first technologists hired into the FTC. He later became CTO of that organization. His technical expertise won him a Pulitzer Prize as part of the Washington Post team that covered national security issues, widespread government surveillance, maybe overreach, back in 2014. Since then, Ashkan has really leaned into the policy front. He co-authored the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, in 2018, and the CPRA in 2020. And he's presently working on the global privacy control. So very pleased to have Ash joining us here as well. So let's go ahead and dive in. As I mentioned, everybody on this panel over the course of their careers has made a material investment in privacy. And as technologists, there's this question, like we can basically do whatever we want, right? Time is the one thing that's the great equalizer. You don't get more time than anybody else. So we have chosen, the folks in this panel, we've chosen to invest significant amounts of our time and energy into privacy. And why do we do that? So the question that I'm going to pose to the panel is, why is privacy important to you? And whoever wants to go first, go ahead and grab it.
I can jump in.
Go ahead.
So privacy is one framing, but I think the way I think about privacy is more about power and balance of power, right? It's about, we know information is power, and we know privacy is essentially a way to protect against information asymmetries, right? You can essentially reveal what you want or not reveal what you want based on control of your personal information. And I think the reason it's so important is that we've gotten to a place where those information asymmetries have grown significantly between our balance of power between us and the government, or individuals and corporations, right? And in general, the most simple way to think of information asymmetries is from a market perspective, for example, around economics, right? Willingness to pay a product. You go to buy a car and you have in your mind a reserve price for what that automobile is and how much you'd be willing to spend for that automobile. And there's some negotiation that happens between you and the seller of the vehicle, the car dealership. If that company or that dealership knows your exact reserve price, they're able to extract all of the social surplus from that interaction. They're able to essentially take that information and extract the most value for themselves. And I think as such, the balancing of privacy, or the ability to protect what information we want to reveal, balances those interests and provides consumers with the equal footing or fairness in their interactions.
Great, thanks, Ash. I read that as privacy as helping to create an economic situation where we can engage without our counterparty having an unfair advantage. And as more and more of our lives move online, that asymmetry is very difficult to protect against, particularly when there are only a small number of companies that really have visibility into most or all of the data. All right, who'd like to go next? Why is privacy important to you?
I can kind of comment why it matters to me. So of course I'm motivated by the big ways we can change the world, banking the unbanked, protecting people in dangerous situations or countries. But to give a more personal answer, I'm blessed that a lot of big things don't actually apply to me. I don't need to hide from my government. They already know my finances from my tax returns. My personal interests are aligned with the local social norms, so I don't really need to have discretion in purchasing. My main adversary from a practical standpoint is the advertising technology industry. I'm really creeped out that they build and share digital profiles of me. It kind of rubs me the wrong way that I'm not paid for that, and I can't even see the information that they're sharing. And ad tech, unlike a judicial system, doesn't need to have high standards, right? There's no penalty for a false positive. If anything seems remotely related, well, we'll just fire hose, brute force ads, all of that. And even my personal credit card, the bank shares my information with their corporate family and their affiliates and all of that. And just honestly, the whole thing annoys me. It actually kind of is one of those power imbalance situations. And so just making a financial system where we can just kind of interact freely, even just out of that sphere of surveillance, is something that's important to me personally.
Great, thanks, Mitchell. That makes a ton of sense. I've spent the majority of my career working in cybersecurity, and the asymmetry that we feel there is really quite profound. So as we've built out Web 1.0 and Web 2.0, we've created these tremendous centralized data stores of personal information that are very appealing to attackers. And it's very difficult, even for well-funded, knowledgeable organizations, to defend against attacks, never mind upstart contenders that are scrambling just to make payroll and try to find product market fit. Cybersecurity is often a distant sort of notion for them to worry about. So I think it's very, even for folks living in the first world where they are banked and their government knows what's on their tax returns, being able to create a new Web3 paradigm in which we reduce the attractiveness of these centralized data stores to threat actors, I think is really appealing.
I can take the next crack at it.
Go ahead, Nick. Thanks.
So online communication between one or more parties, one way to think of privacy is about consent. So who do the parties involved consent to learn about the content of the communication? What do they permit? Who else do they permit to learn about the metadata of the conversation? Like how many messages, people involved, what sort of things were talked about? And this sort of recent evolution in mainstream privacy technologies online comes about from a critical analysis of which parties are in play in the internet as it evolved in sort of a natural way. over the last couple of decades. So say you visit a website, which parties on the internet can read the messages that you post on that website, or what you download? Is it your ISP? Is it a government? Is it cloud providers? Which third parties are these participants sharing information with? And so for much of the history of our online lives, this has been a complete free-for-all, right? If information is completely unencrypted, going through who knows which networks in which countries, and the websites on the back end are potentially sharing informations with advertisers and third parties and building databases and selling them. This is sort of how the internet has been. And as it's reached the scale of most people are online, this has gotten completely unreasonable because it's fully out of the user's control. And so, corporations sharing information without an opt-in, governments accessing it in bulk. So for me, privacy and privacy technology is about bringing human respect or human aspect into the digital world in which consent plays a role.
That's great, Nick. We actually printed up stickers for an event a couple of years ago that I think the meme was, it was a shield that said privacy equals consent. And those were quite popular at the event. I think about the internet architecture and how it's evolved over time. And if privacy equals consent, I think a lot of us were providing consent to introspect all of our data and all of our metadata just through ignorance or through really a lack of foresight or forethought into how these pieces would connect and what the incentives would be for the various parties that are providing those services to us as users or customers or as the product. Great. Teor, you want to bring us home?
Yeah, sure. So for me and for a lot of people I know, privacy is about safety. If I reveal certain information about myself or about my friends or people I've worked with online, those people then get targeted by a bunch of people who don't like who they are or what they're doing. And so sometimes that might be people who are in danger from their families finding out about their interests or their sexuality or their gender identity. Sometimes that might be activists who are doing things that big companies or governments don't like. And so giving people the tools to keep themselves and each other safe really makes a difference to people's ability to survive in the world and people's ability to do the things that they want to do without being interfered with or pressured. And for me, privacy is also a collective endeavor. It's not just enough for individual people to hide their information. Everybody you're in contact with has to be willing to have a similar level of security. Otherwise, they reveal things that you're doing through their interactions with you.
Excellent. Thanks, Teor. So I want to dive in and talk measurable progress. And I want to start in the policy domain. This is a domain that maybe a decade ago I largely kind of ignored, thinking security and privacy are technical things. What does policy have to do with any of that? And AshCon actually helped open my eyes to the importance of policymakers and technical people working together to change the world. And it was shortly after that that we saw meaningful data privacy legislation take form in the EU in the form of GDPR. And then here stateside, which is the heart of the internet, right? We've got the Silicon Valley, we created ARPANET. You would think that we would be on the cutting edge of privacy, and yet we've been lagging behind. However, I think there's been some significant progress. I mentioned during my intro that Ash co-authored the CCPA, and it's my understanding that some state level legislation in Colorado is on track to pass as we speak. So this feels to me like quantifiable, measurable progress, but is it going in the right direction? Ash, would you care to expand on that?
Sure, absolutely. And indeed, yesterday, both houses in Colorado, Senate passed a CCPA-like bill. It's expected to be signed by the governor and go into law. There are some potential loopholes and problems with it, but in general, it does advance one version of online privacy forward. And we've seen indeed a number of states. So in addition to California, we have Virginia, we have New Jersey, New York, and Alaska are also contemplating similar bills. But a lot of the bills focus on things like providing consent, right, which we talked about. Privacy is consent, but to some it's more than that, right? It's perhaps making meaningful consent, or making sure that, for example, in the California law, that consent be free of dark patterns, that consent be freely given and not predicated on access to the service, right? So what that means, I think, is the devil's in the details, but there have been state advancements. There's still federal conversations around privacy. In fact, just today, there was a politically loaded executive order by the Biden administration to evaluate the national security risks introduced by unrestricted sale, transfer of, or access to U.S. person-sensitive data to foreign adversaries. So this is directed at China and Russia, I think, and it's a response to the European Privacy Shield issue, where Europe doesn't trust the U.S. doesn't trust China. No one really trusts anyone. I think it speaks to the fact that there's an increased awareness and increased recognition that privacy is important and that we should have protections. That said, there's also been a lot of kind of development of more privacy invasive technologies, more use, products that invade not only our communications, but into our homes and our wearables. Ad tech themselves, in response to a lot of the privacy legislation, have doubled down, and instead of essentially relying on tracking technologies like vulnerabilities in browsers and third-party cookies and other tracking devices, they're essentially forcing first-party publishers, like when you visit the New York Times, to solicit your login, your user credentials, and then send a hashed version to any third-party advertiser, which in some ways is a more robust identifier than even cookies, right? And provides even more invasive tracking, right? So in response to the policy mitigations, tech has also innovated or moved forward into more privacy invasive technologies. And similarly, in response to developments of privacy preserving technologies like Zcash or like private messaging, governments themselves have also gotten interested in providing, gaining access to encrypted communications, et cetera. So we have some steps forward, we have some awareness, and we have some semblance of rights, for example, in California, preventing third parties you're not intending to interact with from collecting your data. But you also have steps backwards in the form of more invasive technologies, more requests from the government, and kind of a general normalization around these practices. Everyone is kind of used to it these days, and can't envision a world where we're not beholden to platforms that monitor or surveil our communications.
Right. So we're making progress on the policy front, but ad tech is not just going to roll over and say, okay, you win, we're going to stop cooking you and retargeting you. Instead, they're adopting technical measures that may be even worse than what we saw before, where the triangulation was sort of indirect with cookies. Do you believe that it's possible for us to make meaningful forward progress on privacy without re-examining the incentive structures that drive how we consume content on the internet? Or is this something that we would need to consider big picture to make meaningful change?
I think you need both. At the end of the day, and to be clear, it's not just ad tech using technical advantages. In fact, the proliferation of state laws is actually part of the playbook in order to push. For example, the Virginia law is a law in name only. And in fact, ad tech has said exactly as much, where it provides controls over information that identifies you by name, but effectively omits control of any information that relies on a pseudonymous identifier. And so, as everyone in the technical panel knows, most online tracking isn't by David Campbell, it's by user 123. And so all of that tracking and that activity falls outside of the Virginia law. And for non-technical policymakers, they don't realize that distinction. And so they consider they have a win in privacy. But in fact, practically speaking, it actually feeds into the ecosystem. Stepping back, I think to your question, at the end of the day, like, I hate to be a Lessig fanboy, but money in politics is at the root of this, right? You're not going to do away with a multi-billion-dollar industry just straight away without some kicking and fighting. And in fact, when we passed the CCPA and the CPRA, we did so through essentially a referendum process. There's a ballot initiative, it's a crazy process in California where you can put up something for a referendum, and if you get enough votes, it will pass. If the legislature were to pass a law, they would take into consideration not only the interest of consumers who are the constituents, but in California, most of the big tech companies who provide billions of dollars of revenue and millions of dollars at least in taxes, right? And so if we were to see progress, we need to address the fact that the underlying economic model not only promotes these behaviors, but also permits large companies to set the rules of the road, set the laws, and influence policy. So I'm not too hopeful, with the exception that, and I'll give you one caveat, there's now kind of a tension where it's not monolithic, right? It's not big tech against consumers. We have tech fighting tech. We have Cloudflare fighting Google and Facebook. We have Apple fighting. And so there's some kind of ability for us to diversify our interests and have different players take different positions.
So you mentioned being a Lessig fanboy. I know that Lessig created an organization called Root Strikers, evoking a quote from Henry David Thoreau, which says that there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. I get the sense that the people in this room, the people at this conference, and the people like yourself, Ash, fighting the fight on the policy front are actually striking at the root of this problem. So I do grok that it's multidimensional, it's nuanced, there's no simple answers, but I do think that we're making meaningful progress. I want to shift gears for a moment and talk a bit about Cloudflare. And Nick, I know that over time, Cloudflare has made a number of meaningful contributions. The 1.1.1.1 DNS service was a big step forward for fast, privacy-preserving DNS, exposed over encrypted protocols, which was a big first. Cloudflare also was very prominent in supporting the Tor network, making it easier for folks to access content fronted by Cloudflare using the Tor browser. And I also believe that, well, I know that Cloudflare has been prominent in exposing Ethereum services via the Cloudflare gateway. So could you share a little bit of insight from where you sit as to why these types of, why privacy has been sort of at the front of these services? I think that the analytics service is another example where you've got, a shot across the bow of Google Analytics saying, hey, we're going to let you introspect your visitors' behavior, but we're not going to do it in a privacy invading way. How is it that you're able to do that at Cloudflare, and where is it all headed, and how's it going?
Sure, I think I can get to the answer through a roundabout way, but the question of what are the factors that drive the adoption of these new technologies to help improve privacy, and a lot of the reasons here are not just within companies, but within the greater public, the awareness of the reality online of how data is shared. This has really changed. People they thought of the internet as a black box, and they really know there are different participants now. And this has inspired really large policy driven changes. We talked about GDPR, CCPA, and this policy-based enforcement can go a long way. It's a big stick for big companies, but it has to be enforced by people, and to scale it to the entire world. So far, technical solutions also need to be involved as well. And enhancements, you've talked about, HTTPS. One of the things that Cloudflare was early to was offering HTTPS for free. A lot of these improvements haven't been driven by privacy per se. So encryption 6 years ago, websites were 20% encrypted all the time. So meaning any network participant could see anything and change it, or either the user or the site couldn't really consent to any of that. But this was not attacked as a privacy problem, but more as a security problem. And so there's an industry-wide effort to improve the security of the internet online, and privacy has been brought along with it. And now we're over 80% HTTPS on the web. But security is sort of necessary for privacy. You have to have, there's no real sense of privacy on an insecure network. But some of the technologies you talked about, some of these more robust privacy focused technologies have gained some traction. and have done so without riding security's coattails. So IP addresses and host names, these are identifiers, and as identifiers, they can be identify people as well as cryptocurrency addresses and these sort of things. So protecting them from network adversaries is a net positive for privacy. But unlike something like HTTP, where you have a lot of content, hiding them is not necessarily a big win for security. People are not going to extract cookies or security type things. So hiding IP addresses and things like this are actually often considered in the security industry a bad thing. Still, in the last years, we've had things like encrypted DNS, encrypting the host name in things like TLS. So network connections, the SNI is where you say the host name. These things are happening. These multi-hop systems that are focused on metadata privacy, that are somewhat inspired by systems like Tor, these are catching on. So the question here is, what's driving this adoption? And somewhat surprisingly, in a technical area, these changes, again, are driven by awareness, and then that awareness has been used for marketing. And so privacy has become a selling point. And for companies whose revenue model is not based on data collection and aggregation, the idea of privacy-conscious technology helps reduce the consumer's dread that comes along with the understanding of the costs of being online. And so technical solutions are can be considered more robust than policy solutions in some cases where there are no policy coverage. And if we're talking about things that are beyond just the EU and California and now Colorado and places like this. So there's not a need for an auditor and a punishment regime. We can sort of analyze these protocols and see if they give what they actually give. So this divide between systems and companies that are their business model is based on collecting and aggregating information versus those who don't, as was mentioned earlier, I believe is going to grow, and it's going to be sort of a fascinating battleground for privacy technology. So companies who are in the plumbing, as you said, as you sort of described Cloudflare, can focus on this and have it be a part of the reason why people will feel more comfortable using these type of services, because the financial incentive is not there, because it's not part of the business model. So I think that's part of the reason why we've been able to do like privacy first analytics, which we are working on improving, by the way, and things like encrypted DNS, oblivious DNS, and pushing forward on a lot of these privacy technologies.
Great. Thanks, Nick. And I want to come back to you in a little bit and talk about that more. I think you hit a nerve for me that was really triggered by watching Moxie Marlinspike on Joe Rogan, and his mantra during that like 4-hour-long interview was something along the lines that bad business models create bad technology, which creates bad outcomes. So when we see businesses whose entire business model relies upon aggregating data and selling it to third parties with whom the consumer has no relationship with, that I think creates a slippery slope towards bad tech and bad outcomes. So it's been really exciting for me to see Cloudflare's evolution, because I've been a Cloudflare fanboy since the very beginning. And initially the product was really focused on just distributed denial of service mitigation and making things go faster. It turns out from that vantage point, wow, you can really add meaningful security. And wow, that has privacy benefit. And wow, now consumers and enterprises are voting with their wallets and their purchasing as to paying a premium for privacy and for knowing that the people that they're doing business with aren't selling their data without their consent or knowledge. So great stuff. Next up, Teor, I'd like to talk with you a bit about the experiences you had. I know I had the occasion to read the paper that you created recently, a co-author of a paper that was looking at essentially adoption and usage of the Tor network and the Tor browser. And I understand this is a hard problem. It's difficult to get instrumentation into a system that is designed to be privacy preserving. So could you share for us, Teor, a bit about what that experience was like and what you learned about Tor and its adoption, really, as a function of going through that experience.
Sure. So we worked on a paper where we collected privacy-preserving statistics using both differential privacy and, gosh, I'm trying to remember the exact technical term for it. Actually, no, I think it was differential privacy in both cases, but in different ways. And so we were collecting a bunch of statistics on how many unique IP addresses were using Tor in terms of clients, how many connections there were to Tor, how much bandwidth was going through the Tor network. And we were able to do this all safely by running a number of Tor relays and collecting those statistics in a way that was only where the total was only available once all of the data had been aggregated. And so it was a very safe way of collecting those statistics because we couldn't go and collect we couldn't go and drill down to individual relays or individual times of the day. We simply got a number at the end. And so that was a really interesting experience. We had the advantage that the Tor project itself had been collecting statistics for a number of years. And so we could compare the statistics that we were seeing with the statistics that Tor had been getting through a different process where they took statistics from each individual relay and they broadly, and they combined them together and then did some calculations to come up with a number of users. We actually discovered that Tor might have as many as 5 times as many users as they'd been estimating. And so we know that back in, gosh, when was this? 2018, Tor had roughly somewhere between 1 million and 10 million users, which is one of the problems with collecting this kind of data, is that you get a very broad range. And particularly when you're using differential privacy, you can get very broad ranges. And so that was one of the challenges of the research, was that the amount of noise we had to add to safely collect statistics meant that some statistics simply weren't able to be collected. And I guess that was fine because that gave us an indication of which statistics were really risky to collect and we probably shouldn't be collecting them.
Great. Thanks, Teor. Mitchell, I'd like to spend some time digging in with you. I understand that you've spent quite a bit of time thinking about the difference between on-paper privacy, and speaking specifically in a blockchain cryptocurrency space here, the difference between on-paper privacy versus practical privacy. And I think what's great about having you here is that you've got experience working with multiple projects. There is a lot of tribalism within cryptocurrency, which I think is really tragic. It sets us back as an industry and as a community. So I really appreciate your ability to be agile and nimble, working on multiple projects concurrently. But could you share for us a bit of your point of view as to how privacy in the cryptocurrency space works today, how it's progressed, and what might be needed to take it to the next level going forward?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of differentiating between on-paper privacy and practical privacy, a lot of my focus lies on what information is leaked in the metadata. So if, for example, you look at a shielded to shielded Zcash transaction, the amount is encrypted, where it's coming from is encrypted, like very securely encrypted. I can't, whatever, machine learn on ciphertext or anything. However, all of these perfectly encrypted fields are, put together into a transaction. And when that all goes together, you can see things start to get a little bit wonky, especially if non-standard software is used. So like some of my current interests are looking at like fees. So for example, normally there's, I think the recommended Zcash fee is 0.00001 Zcash. But there's all kinds of people that undercut that. They do zero fee, they try to get in front, they pay higher fees. And so what ends up happening is if you have someone who is creating a series of transactions and they're using a peculiar fee over and over again, that can be heuristically linked. That's where the on paper difference comes in, right? On paper, it's just an encrypted transaction. Practically, when you look at the data, you can see these strings of peculiar fees or weird unlock times, things like that. And so a lot of where I devote my brain cycles is looking at like, what is every value or set of values that can go into something, and can we like trim it down or make it uniform? So like, can we create a privacy preserving fee market that only allows certain values so people aren't leaking their software? Can we like apply some rules to the unlock time so it's not like the wild west of any integer between 0 and uint16? So a lot of this actually comes down to conformance. I'll look at what the conformance among transactions and any ways that they can differ. And then also just thinking about kind of even the stuff outside of the transaction, like periodic timing, right? If a transaction is run exactly every 27 minutes or something. And so that's a lot of where I play. And this is actually where it comes down to which of these impact you depends on the rules your adversary is playing by, right? So if your adversary has a very high standard of evidence, saying, oh, this string of transactions with a peculiar fee may or may not be circumstantial. Whereas if you're working with either, if your threat is either criminals or low standard of evidence or ad tech or whatever, then they may just go ahead and roll with that, right? And view that as a heuristic way to link transactions. And so that's, I guess, in a nutshell, where a lot of my energy goes. Is like, what are the heuristics? And then how do we engineer the protocol to lock them down?
Great. Thanks, Mitchell. So I wanted to take a bit of time to look at some spicy topics. So we've had an interesting week for cryptocurrency security and privacy. We've seen the Colonial Pipeline attack, the ransom paid in Bitcoin, the government seizing funds that apparently were held on a custodial exchange. And in the midst of this, we also saw WWDC. Apple has basically been pushing a more and more pro-privacy stance over time. So I see these as two sort of competing forces, where on one hand, we've got the government and law enforcement saying, oh my gosh, we've got hackers attacking critical infrastructure. We need backdoors in all the crypto, and we need to be able to escrow all the keys and have full visibility into everything. On the other hand, we've got Tim Cook standing up on stage and marketing privacy as a first-class feature. And I think it was Bruce Schneier that mentioned recently that he sees a world evolving where we've got feudalism around privacy and security, where us poor end users basically need to depend on a feudal lord in the form of a company like Apple or Cloudflare, for example, to protect us. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking broadly about these competing forces. And I'm going to start with you, Nick, because I think that it's very interesting to see at WWDC Apple announcing essentially a network anonymity feature for iOS. It's not Tor, but it kind of looks and feels and smells a little bit like Tor. And it essentially gets behind this notion that really inspired the topic for this panel, which was, do you need privacy if you've got nothing to hide? And I think Apple launching a product like this is evidence that, well, why, yes, we do. So Nick, do you want to comment on this new development and this, what appears to be a partnership between Apple and Cloudflare as two companies that I think are putting privacy first as an important feature for their customers?
So I think the conversation that you started in talking about privacy with respect to having a few large companies that are there to kind of protect privacy is one angle and one side of the coin. And I think something that can scale to the broader large percentage of sort of mainstream users of technology. But it's not necessarily something that covers all the use cases that privacy needs to cover. So if you want to make the analogy with something like a closed network where you have several tiers of mutually disjoint organizations that proxy data. And there's a small set of those organizations. To take the blockchain analogy, you are thinking about like an open system versus a closed system. So something like Zcash, anybody can run a node, and the network itself is essentially open to anyone who wants to participate, versus something like a closed corporate blockchain type of network. They both have their places, they both have their use cases, but they're very different. And so I think we should caution from thinking, okay, great, Cloudflare or whoever, so some large company who's running one of these networks has solved privacy for everyone. I think that's definitely not the case. There's a real place for systems like Tor that actually are designed for anonymity. The system that you described is really a privacy-oriented technology that's meant to hide certain pieces of metadata from certain individuals. So I think there's a spectrum, and we should respect the fact that the use cases in the world are quite diverse. And so this is a great step. I think this is something that other companies who, if they have the opportunity to learn less about their users and not affect their business model, or if they could change their business model so that they can continue doing what they need to do with learning less about their users, I think that's a good thing, and that's a model that should be followed. But in the realm of privacy technology, there's a much wider spectrum.
Great, that's great perspective, Nick. I know that we are getting short on time. I did want to take an opportunity to field an audience question here. This question says, regarding policy and law enforcement, is there a tension between privacy at scale and regulation and law enforcement versus privacy in the small and slow?
I can jump in on that.
Great.
I would suggest that if you don't have privacy at large, you don't actually have privacy, unless there's a very large set of people who have privacy or anonymity. Then you're not looking at actual privacy. There's not a large enough group to hide in. But also, I think it's important to recognize that even a lot of law enforcement organizations have admitted that mass collection of data doesn't really give them solid leads, or it gives them a huge volume of data that they then have to sort through. So I don't think it's as simple as saying there's a tension here. I think that there are a lot of trade-offs here, and that a lot of groups have basically gone and admitted that mass collection of data isn't particularly helpful for investigations, but it is very, very damaging to privacy.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm going to take that audience question and put a slightly different spin on it and say, I'll postulate or assert that in a world where we have strong privacy, can law enforcement still do their job? Can they still catch bad guys doing bad stuff? And I know, Ash, you mentioned something that popped up in the headlines this week as an example that may be germane to that question. Yeah,
I think in this, I want to echo Mitchell's comments around, or Teor's comments around scale, and kind of put the other opposite spin on it, which is, in this domain, I think in the domain of privacy, security, and encryption, the perfect is in fact the enemy of the good. And by that, I mean, if you have a perfectly impenetrable system, and system I use broadly, not just the encryption, but the system as a whole, then there creates policy vulnerabilities where there are going to be crimes and issues and problems that need to be solved that your system prevents. And so the NAM example is a great example, which is that law enforcement was able to infiltrate one of the largest networks of, something like 1,900 groups were implicated as part of that crackdown recently, the 3-year investigation. And they did so not by attacking encryption, but attacking human behavior and convincing people, social engineering people to run insecure apps, et cetera. So there was some sort of pressure relief valve in the system as a whole that permitted legitimate law enforcement needs that society arguably needs without undermining technical security. And so if you were to ever build a system that would mitigate any potential attempts of law enforcement that was perfectly impenetrable, that would be actually, I think, problematic, because then there would be legitimate cases that are not able to be followed up on. And therefore, you might get policymakers undermining the entire ecosystem at large.
Great. Thanks, Ash. So folks, unfortunately, we got a few other questions we don't have time to get to, but we appreciate your time and attention. I want to give a big thanks to our panelists. I really enjoyed spending this time speaking with you. And I look forward to continuing to strike at that root of evil alongside you, shoulder to shoulder, fighting the good fight here. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my friend and colleague, Jack Gavigan, for some closing remarks. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, DC. Well, folks, like DC said, this marks the end of ZCon 2. 2 days, 19 sessions, 53 presenters and panelists, and a lot of work that went on behind the scenes to ensure that everything ran smoothly. I don't know about you, but I'm super pleased with how this event has gone. We've had a bunch of great talks and panels. The Discord has been hopping. There were 386 users registered when I just checked a few minutes ago. The most popular session so far in terms of YouTube views has been the panel on user-defined assets with 439 views. I'm sure we'll see that rise over the coming days. I want to thank all of our speakers and panelists, without whom this would have been a pretty boring conference. And I also want to give the due credit for the tremendous work that's been happening behind the scenes. Danica and Paige from the Foundation, who have been working for months planning this entire event and lining up the speakers and the panelists. Janie and Elena from ECC for their help in herding the speakers and panelists. Mine Zcash, who's a stalwart of the Zcash community, and some members of the Zcash Foundation team who have been doing Q&A moderation. And Alex, the Zcash Foundation's new COO, who's been taking care of Twitter and Discord announcements. Finally, and most importantly, I want to give a huge thank you to Ryan, who has single-handedly taken care of all of the AV and streaming and has done it completely flawlessly. If you'd like to give Ryan a tip in Zec, check the lobby channel in Discord for instructions on how to do that. And he certainly deserves it, because without him, this would not have gone anywhere near as smoothly as it has done. Now, hopefully the next ZCon will be in person, but in the meantime, stay involved by joining the Zcash community forums, which can be very lively at times. Tune into our fortnightly Arborist calls, which are hosted by ECC, and there we talk about protocol development of Zcash and future ideas for future network upgrades. Join the Zcash R&D Discord server, follow us on Twitter, and if you think you can contribute to Zcash, submit a grant application to the Zcash Open Major Grants Committee. They have a big fund and they're just waiting to see some great grants come through that they can fund. And don't forget that we're expanding the community advisory panel, and we're looking for people who are interested in serving on the Zcash Foundation's board. And for that, go and check our blog and go and nominate yourself via the forums if you're interested in doing that. Finally, thank you all for attending and participating in ZCon 2. The Zcash community, all of you are essential to the success of Zcash, and we at the Foundation and the team at the Electric Coin Company can only do so much. We need your help to multiply our efforts and to give us feedback on what we're doing well, and more importantly, what we're doing badly. On that note, please fill out the feedback form. You can find that link also in the Discord lobby channel. Well, that's all, folks. Hopefully we'll be together in person for the next ZCon. But for now, wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.